of the other defendants got completely away with what they did to my son. If you take a life, you do life, okay? There should be no plea deals for murder.
And what
Those
about
cases need to be brought to trial.
And what about your family, Ms. Brame? Do you feel your family was treated appropriately in the criminal justice system?
Absolutely not. We were treated like garbage.
Tell me about that.
We got no answers. If it wasn't for my persistence, all right, if it wasn't for my not missing one court date, except for the one where they dropped the murder and gang assault charge against Mary Saunders because Alvin Bragg's office did not inform me that they were doing that, which is my right to know that. I didn't get a chance to give my victim impact statement when they sentenced her to that 1 year time served. Okay, so they treated us like garbage. They didn't reveal any information. I had to do a lot of research myself. That's one of the reasons why I formed my Victims' Rights Reform Council, to help others and families of homicide victims, to help them navigate that court system, because we got no services. There is no services in New York City for victims. If there is, I have no idea what they are.
Thank you, ma'am. Councilman Holden, you've called for legislation that would give judges more discretion when setting bail conditions for defendants who may pose a threat to public safety. Would you tell us a bit more about your proposals and why you believe they are important?
Well, New York State is the only state in the union that a judge cannot consider how dangerous the defendant is. So if he's committed a number of crimes before, the judge can't consider that. The only state in the union. So that's why you have repeat offenders out on the streets. This is so ridiculous, so absurd, that a judge cannot consider how dangerous an individual is who was arrested. And that's why people are walking. And so we've made proposals to our state colleagues. Let's change this. Why are we the only state in the union that does this? I mean, you have to question that. But again, so many people doing this.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. Thank you, Mr. Holden. We'll sure you'll get more time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Brame, you failed to note that as a result of D.A. Bragg's prosecution, 2 men are currently serving life sentences for the murder of your son. Mr. Kessler, in your testimony, you noted that New York City is safer than most cities and even most states in America. The police department's own data show that since D.A. Bragg took office, shootings in Manhattan have declined by 20%, homicides have declined by 16%, and the rates of virtually every other type of violent crime are lower during the first quarter of this year than they were at this time last year. In the meantime, homicide rates in places such as Ohio, Louisiana, Texas, and Arizona are much higher than in New York. As someone who studies crime trends, what do you think accounts for this disparity in safety between Manhattan and other parts of the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. So I don't think any place in this country is really safe, okay, because we're awash in guns. New York is safer, and it's, on average, New York City is safer than Ohio, Texas, many other places. I think number one is gun ownership rates, okay? So gun ownership rates in red states tend to be about twice the gun ownership rates in blue states. There are other factors as well. Poverty rates matter. Educational attainment is often a correlation with crime. And I also think that in certain states, cities in those states are starved for resources because, frankly, the governors don't really care about getting votes in those states. And so I think some of the urban areas in southern states, the amount of police that they have per capita is far less than in places like New York City, and all the resources for schools and after-school programs. But I think number one is gun ownership rates.
Thank you. How does New York City's murder rate compare to the national average?
New York City's murder rate is 18% below the national average, and I believe has been below the national average every single year since 2010, and I think several years before that, between 2000 and 2010.
How about assault?
The assault rates are lower.
And burglary?
Burglary rates are lower.
Larceny?
Lower.
And rape?
Lower.
And how do the incidence of those crimes in New York City compared to the national average?
In all of those cases, New York City's rates are lower.
How does New York City's murder rate compare to that of Ohio?
New York City's murder rate in 2020, I should say Ohio's murder rate in 2020 was 59% higher than New York City's.
And what about the rate of rape in Ohio compared to New York
The rate of rape in Ohio was 280% higher,
than in New York? And assault
34% higher,
and burglary
146% higher,
and larceny
346% higher
than in New York?
than
How
in
do
New
the
York City.
incidence rates of those crimes in New York City compare to the national averages?
Okay. New York City's murder rate is 18% below the national average. Rate of rape 58% lower. Rate of robbery is 102% higher. Rate of assault 16% lower. Rate of burglary 44% lower. Rate of larceny 71% lower. Rate of motor theft 58% lower. So lower on 6 out of the 7.
Now, let's talk specifically about violent crime. Based on your review of crime data, does New York have a higher or lower rate of violent crime than Florida?
Lower.
And what about Louisiana?
Lower.
Kentucky?
Lower.
Arizona?
Lower.
North Carolina?
Lower.
If you were able to decide or given a choice of where to hold a hearing about violent crime in America, what are some of the cities or states where you think a hearing would be most needed and most effective, and why?
Well, I think you could certainly hold hearings in places like, Louisville, very high rates. Jacksonville, very high crime rates there. There's a lot of Alabama, Mississippi, extraordinarily high murder rates in those states. Some in cities, some not in cities. New York City there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the city because there's 8.5 million people here. But relative to the rest of the country, it's doing better.
And finally, according to CDC data, the states with the highest rates of gun deaths are Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, Missouri, Alabama, and Alaska. What trends are you seeing with respect to gun violence generally in red states?
What we found when we looked at between 2000 and 2020 is the murder rate in red states, as defined by the 25 states that voted for Donald Trump in 2020 versus the 25 states that voted for Joe Biden, the murder rate in red states was higher than the murder rate in blue states in all 21 of those years. And over a cumulative 21-year period, it was 23% higher in those red states. And even if you took out the largest blue city in each of the red states, the murder rate was 12% higher in red states.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman may state his parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, my parliamentary inquiry is, in light of the testimony you just heard, what is the mechanism for the committee to transfer this hearing to Ohio, where the crime rate is significantly greater than here in New York? Is there a motion?
Not a parliamentary inquiry.
It is about, I'm asking parliamentary, how do we move the venue so we can have a hearing in a city or state that has a serious crime problem? The state of Ohio.
Not a properly stated parliamentary inquiry. The gentleman's time is expired.
Appeal the ruling of the chair.
It's not appealable ruling.
Mr. Jordan, I'm sorry. If Mr. Nadler is going to make derogatory comments towards the mother of a homicide victim, he could at least allot her some time to respond.
The lady is not recognized. Hang on. Committee will be in order. Committee will be in order. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Pursuant to what you just said, I think it is important that you have an opportunity to respond to the statement by the ranking member that justice was served in the case of your loss. Ms. Blaine.
Sergeant Hassan Kari is dead forever. Dead forever. There are 4 people directly responsible for his murder. 2 people is not justice. And until there is justice for the murder of my son, there will be no peace. None. All 4, I'm asking for a special prosecutor to reopen those murder and gang assault charges against Mary Stewart, Mary Saunders, and Travis Stewart. Present that evidence, present that video to a jury, and allow them to decide those homicidal maniacs innocence or guilt. My son is dead forever. They deserve to be in prison forever. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harrison, there's been a lot of discussion at the end of the dais about gun violence. All three of you at that end, were there guns involved in the murder?
No, there were not. Madeline's son was stabbed, and my boyfriend and his best friend were both stabbed to death.
So, knives kill.
There's a will, there's a way, and when evil wants to attack, evil is going to attack. And I would also like to say that, New York might have strict gun laws, but we also have conflicting gun laws, which I haven't heard from Ms. Fisher regarding raise the age. Immediately after the Buffalo incident, Kathy Hochul implemented a raise the age that placed a ban on purchasing certain weapons from minors. But we also have an original raise the age law that conflicts that completely because it eliminates the criminal prosecution of any minor holding an illegal weapon.
And in this state, you have a universal assault weapons ban and have for a long time. Isn't that true?
I'm not sure about the assault weapons ban. I'm sorry.
Okay. And Mr. Alba, I think your testimony was very powerful. You too were attacked by other than a gun. Isn't that correct? And if you'd pause the clock.
That's correct.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
There was no gun involved.
And your response that saved your life was also not a gun. Is that correct? Well, I appreciate the fact that you were able to respond. In New York, if I understand correctly, even though you were operating a store, you were not allowed to have a weapon to protect yourself in the way of a gun. Is that correct? And I'd like to, go ahead.
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, in New York, you defended yourself with a knife because as a store operator, you were not allowed to have a gun. Is that correct? Okay, but you don't own a gun. Is that correct?
Yeah, he doesn't own a gun. He doesn't really know much.
Okay, thank you. And then I think, Mr. Holden, you probably could answer this. According to the figures we were given earlier, at least 6,000 of the 19,000 weapons were New York-based weapons. Is it true that guns go missing and get stolen and get straw purchased here in New York in spite of the most stringent laws in the country?
Exactly. You're not going to get every gun off the street. The iron pipeline is a problem. We know that. But a lot of guns come from New York City. A lot of guns are made in New York City, put together in New York City. The problem we have in New York State and New York City is we have some of the toughest gun laws in the nation, but they don't enforce them. The courts are not enforcing them. The DAs are not enforcing them. So this is a big problem. You have multiple shootings, one individual, 5 arrests for shootings, and he's back on the street.
Well, and
how is that working?
Yeah, and Mr. Giacomo, you represent so many of our brave men and women in blue. Can you comment on that failure to enforce existing laws leading to the kind of both gun and non-gun violence that New York is seeing?
Like we said earlier, it was brought out in the hearing that New York City police and detectives took an amazing amount of firearms off the streets. And every time they do that, they put their life in harm's way. They confront an armed felon, and they put their life in harm's way. Just for that individual to walk out the door the next day and again get a firearm and use it either in a robbery or in a gang-related violence.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to take all the time that should have been paused, But I do want to comment that a lot has been made about moving the venue or other places we could be. And I will reiterate on behalf of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, yes, we could be having this in Los Angeles. Yes, we could be having it in San Francisco. There are other places around the country in which systematically district attorneys are not enforcing the laws and leading to the kind of terrible stories we're hearing here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. I do think that there is a reason why we're in this jurisdiction. But first, let me just say, all of us on this committee, no matter our party, are opposed to crime, and all of us have sympathy for victims of crime. But I will say also that we don't have jurisdiction. The federal government does not have jurisdiction over state and local prosecutions. That's up to the voters of each state and each locality. But if we were going to have a hearing that we have no jurisdiction to deal with, I think we might go to a place in the Speaker's District, which has much higher crime rates than New York City. As has been mentioned, Bakersfield has a homicide rate of 13.7% per 100,000 people. New York is at 5.5 for the same amount of residents. And I'll note also that 100% of the fatal officer-involved shootings involved a gun. And, you know, Mr. Jordan, in his opening statement, mentioned his sympathy for the police. We all have that. I also have sympathy for the officers who defended us against a MAGA mob, unlike some members on the other side of the aisle. I think it's pretty obvious that we're in New York because of the case of New York versus Donald J. Trump. But I'm also worried that we're not here about guns, because 80% of all the murders in the U.S. are committed with a gun. We had 155 mass shootings so far this year. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have prevented any kind of sensible gun violence legislation from passing to keep us safe. Now, you know, we're not the only country in the world with people who want to do bad things or with people who are unstable, but we're the only country in the world that has mass shootings practically every other day, and that is something that's within our jurisdiction, and we ought to take some action. This is a choice that we are making to allow all the children of America to go into school worried that they're going to be the victim of a mass shooting, and it's a scandal that we have done nothing about it. Now, talking about the people versus Donald J. Trump, we don't have jurisdiction over that either. That's something that is a local prosecution, and it's entirely improper for the federal government or any committee of the United States to try and interfere in this matter. So having said that, I want to talk a little bit more about, or ask a little bit more about gun violence and what can be done about it. Ms. Fisher, it's been suggested, or Mr. Kessler, either of you, that somehow having more guns would make us safer. Did the statistics actually back that up, that having more guns makes for a safer community?
States with strong gun laws have lower rates of gun violence. And one of the things that's important to say here is that crime is going down in New York City, thankfully. But there is more that can be done by Congress to enact strong universal background checks, a strong extreme risk protection order law at the federal level, and to fund state laws. There's more that can be done to enact safe storage laws and to combat the trafficking crisis. And Congress is standing idly by and not doing anything.
Let me ask you about, some of our colleagues have suggested that we defund the prosecutor's office here in Manhattan. It's my understanding that the majority of the funds comes from an annual grant to the office's Witness Aid Services Unit that provides services to victims of crime. What would the impact be of eliminating those services if you know, Ms. Kessler? Or Ms. Fisher?
Sure. We need to be investing and putting more resources into victim services and supporting victims. As you heard here today, we need to be giving victims more mental health support, more social support. We need to be helping them find access to compensation, not only for funeral expenses, for hospital expenses, to make up for lost income.
Let me just say, I want to thank all the witnesses, including the victims of crime. I fear that you are being used for a political purpose despite your sincerity.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady's, the committee will be in order. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Our criminal justice system is insane. It's dangerous. It's harmful. And it is destroying the fabric of our city. Time and again, our police officers make an arrest, and then the person who is arrested for assault, felonious assault, robberies, and gun possession, they're finding themselves back on the street within days, if not hours, after arrest. Eric Adams, New York mayor. My friends, the reason we are here in New York is because you have Democrats, you have citizens calling for some relief from this pain, and we are here not to use anyone, but to uplift the voices of brave people who are here to tell their story. Ms. Brame, do you feel used in this hearing?
Gentleman's recognized.
Ms. Brame, do you feel used?
Not.
Ms. Harrison?
I'm a willing participant.
Ms. Harrison, do you feel used? Tell you what, let me ask you it this way. Do you feel more used by this committee hearing, or do you feel more used by a criminal justice system that allowed people to kill people that you love and care about with no consequence?
The latter, and I'm beyond grateful for the opportunity to testify here on behalf of victims, because the Democrat Party, including Mr. Nadler and everybody here today, has ignored us in this city. And we need federal oversight. We need help. We're not getting any kind of help. And the services that she wants to keep funding are not being provided to the victims. I have a woman sitting outside who is a victim of domestic violence, who was conned by an immigrant, and she is receiving no services whatsoever. So until we get a thorough audit to the outcomes of the services being provided, no, we need to find out what's going wrong and get the services to where they need to be.
I am not here to criticize any New Yorkers except maybe one, and that's because so many New Yorkers will soon become Florida voters. This is an iconic city. It's actually our nation's most iconic city. And it's not because of the beautiful architecture, and it's not because of the geography. It is because the sense of hustle that is so inherent to the people who come to New York to achieve their dreams. And increasingly, that hustle is being replaced with fear. Mr. Councilman Holden, you and I are from different parties. If we talked about 1,000 things, we'd probably disagree about a vast majority of them. But here's my simple question for you. Is fear a rising feature of life in New York, or is fear a declining feature of life in New York?
It is increasingly worrisome what we're going through in New York City. Fear is an everyday event in New York City. Taking the subway. My wife is Asian American. She will not get on a New York City subway. My daughter will not get on a New York City subway for fear, because many Asian Americans have been attacked.
But Mr. Kessler says there's just a lot of people here in Manhattan. You just have to take it. You just have to understand that this is going to be a violent place.
Which I found